So we never had any problems with the IRS, fire department, police department, because we always had a clicker ourselves to make sure that not too many people were in the room. You know, we felt we couldn't afford to run the risk of doing anything like that. There was no need to. You know, we had too much money at stake. And by the way, each club was a separate corporation. So if one had a problem, it didn't affect the other clubs.
Who are we speaking with? State your name.
Noel Hankin.
Let's start from the beginning. Where were you born? Where did you grow up?
I was born in Kingston, Jamaica, but I don't have an accent and I can't even fake one because they brought me to this country when I was 3 and we lived in a neighborhood with Americans, not Jamaicans. So, because there are some people born in this country who have a Jamaican accent because they're born around Jamaicans. Anyway, that's my short story background. I was 3 years old when I came up. And back then, you know, my aunts and uncles, more than my parents, kept saying to me, "You're a genius. You should be a doctor or a lawyer." And so growing up as a kid, this is probably a common story. All I knew about was doctor and lawyer. And never wound up being either one, although I was pre-med for a while. And wound up graduating with a degree in sociology, which absolutely helped me because what we did was take advantage of a sociological situation in New York City, where you had a high crime, white flight, budget shortfalls, few policemen on the street, a lot of strikes, transit strikes, sanitation strikes, post office strike, recession that particularly crippled New York. So New York was in a devastating situation, losing population like crazy. And here we come along, an emergent Black middle class, just recent college graduates. And you know what that gave us? Full access to some prestigious venues that ordinarily we couldn't touch. So we wound up putting together as promoters a network of discotheques in midtown Manhattan starting in 1971. And to give you a frame of reference, Saturday Night Fever and Studio 54 came out in 1977. So with these nightclubs, these discotheques we promoted with mixed music, first time I ever heard a record manipulated to create a new sound and a new experience. And it started for most of us. Now, I'm not saying no one did it before. I know people did it before, but for my crowd, which was a pretty hip crowd, young and hip, it was the first time they were exposed to this. And one of the main songs that I can remember from '71 is Theme from Shaft, where my DJ partners kept that music going for like 10 minutes by going from one turntable to the other, back and forth, playing the bridge over and over. And people were dancing the penguin, which is a hard dance to do because you got to get up on your toes, go back and forth, put your full body weight from left to right in time to the music. That's not easy. You know, most folks my age can't do it anymore. But I say all that to say that we created a movement, and one by one, the clubs that we promoted had found a reason for us to leave. Either they wanted to take over and take the cash at the door themselves, or their lease expired, they didn't want to renew. So we started building our own club starting in 1973. Again, 4 years before Studio 54. And by the way, Steve Rebell, one of the creators of Studio 54, came by our club twice to ask us how we did what we did, how we charge for drinks, how we admit people, what our process is. So we shared all that because we knew his audience was very different than ours. And what Steve did, a very clever guy, what he did was the complete opposite of what we did. We were charging $5 to $7. He was charging $15 to $20. Now our crowd couldn't afford $15 to $20, different crowd. So what he did was, he was gay and he preferred interesting people. And in his opinion, the gay folks dressed more interestingly. We had a dress requirement to keep the riffraff out. Our dress requirement was a jacket, no sneakers, no jeans. You had to remove your hat. With his dress regulations, the more wild and crazy your outfit, the better. We had a policy where if you were caught smoking or doing drugs of some type in the bathroom or something, you would be banned for a month. Steve Rebel was very permissive with drugs. In fact, according to several reports, several in places like the New York Times, he dispensed them. He gave drugs to all his friends. So, drugs was not a problem there. Totally different vibe than our set. We were conservative. So conservative, this may surprise some people. Folks did not dance by themselves or with other girls, didn't dance with other girls. It was all coupled. Line dances, still coupled. We were that conservative. Now, shortly after that, culture began to shift. People started dancing separately. That was more acceptable. But it was a rare occurrence in 1971 in the Black middle-class community. I can tell you that. I'm not saying it never happened, but you got talked about. People would point, look at those two women over there dancing by themselves. And when that happened, you know what guys would do? Go over there and start dancing with them. So they wouldn't have to dance by themselves.
How much money would you make in a night at your parties?
I'll tell you, when we first started as promoters, we were netting $1 million a year. Now, back in 1971, that's huge money. We had 7 events a week at 5 different clubs. Some clubs 2 nights a week, some clubs 1 night a week. And when we built our own clubs, initially, we were making quite a bit less. But after we wound up with 5 clubs, we built a total of 5 clubs, 3 in Manhattan, all in Midtown, 1 in Brooklyn and 1 in Queens. And when we got to that configuration, we were making over $2.5 million a year.
Wow, and this is in the 70s.
Yeah, in the 70s.
Wow.
And these clubs lasted until the mid 80s. 87, I think, was the last club that closed, 87.
Wow. Let's start from the beginning. What is TBOF?
The Best of Friends. I'll tell you the story of how that name came to be, because it didn't just come out of thin air. I was part of a social club that gave dances. Well, it was very popular to give dances back then. This was in the 60s, late 60s. And we had live music, name bands like Junior Walker and the All-Stars, Joe Cuba, Eddie Palmieri, acts like that. Latin was big, by the way, back then, real big. So we always had an R&B band and a Latin band. And we decided to give a dance in Manhattan. And since we were all from Queens, we partnered with 4 guys that we heard had a nice following. And we figured we'll get together with these 4 guys from Queens, 4 guys from Manhattan, and give a big dance in the city. And the dance was a success, but the guys from Manhattan said at the end of the night, they paid all the bills, but there was no money left. They controlled the door, they controlled the cash. And we knew, based on the crowd, several $100s, like $500, $600 at least, should have been in the till. And they denied that they had any money left over. And so we never got a dime from this dance with all the hard work we put into it. So we called a meeting with our good friends in Queens and said, we're gonna form a new social club. And someone said, well, it helps if we can trust each other. And someone else said, yeah, if you're really good friends, you can trust each other. And so someone else came up with the name, The Best of Friends. And the whole premise of this new social club was trust. And it was implicit and explicit trust. So we started giving dances and wound up learning how to give discotheques. I was invited to a birthday party one day in Midtown, and they had recorded music, about 150, 200 Black folks dancing on a Wednesday night to hot music. And I thought, wow, this is what we should be doing. Midtown was a place that nobody hung around after work. You went uptown or you went to Black communities in Queens or Brooklyn, whatever. There was no place to hang out in Midtown that really appealed to us in an intimate way, where there was no emotional connection. So that's when, and we had to keep in mind, a Black middle class beginning to emerge in Midtown, Buppies, they called us, Black urban professionals. So I recognized that there was an opportunity to create a space in Midtown that would appeal to these folks. And that's when we got into the business as promoters initially, and then owned our own clubs.
Wow. And how many of you were there at the beginning?
We started off, when we were giving dances, we were 12 of us, and our dances were hugely successful. We built up a mailing list of over 3,000 names. And Danny, one of my partners, had a friend who worked at IBM. And what she did was take all of our addresses, put them in a machine, and create punch cards. And the punch cards could create sticky labels, that you could put on envelopes. And that's how we rolled. We had these 3,000 labels. We gave a dance. It was automatic. The room was full. And we made phone calls too, but the labels did the hard work, because you got to mail out the flyer with all the information. Everybody had it in front of them. And so we used that mailing list to promote our discotheques in Midtown. Plus, I was in advertising at the time, so my partner and I, CP, we made up the flyers, fit inside your jacket pocket. So whenever we saw an attractive person who looked like they were doing well, we'd invite them to the party. And with 8 people passing out flyers, plus 3,000 strong mailing lists, that's pretty impressive. Now, I said we started off with 12. 4 guys left while we were giving dances. It wasn't to make money, it was just for fun. And they got married, they were in grad school, they had kids, things like that. So it made sense for them to step aside. 8 of us were left, and we had no knowledge we were going to be making that kind of money. But as soon as we put together that first discotheque, which was every week on Thursday night, we made $600 a night. Every Thursday, it was automatic. And we started adding more clubs, more nights, increased the price. Next thing you know, the money was rolling in so fast, it became a chore to count the cash. It was a big project to count the cash. So we would do it. And Tony Cooper, who was our president, was very particular. And he wanted the money counted a certain way. And what that meant was not just that you had to count it twice to get the same number, but you had to put all the bills with all the faces up and facing in the same direction.
Why?
And that didn't change the count, but it gave us a discipline to the process, which was important, made us feel a sense of discipline. That's what it did. Wow. Almost like in the military, when a lot of things you do in the military are strictly for discipline. They don't affect your ability to fight. But they do give you a sense of confidence when you go to battle after going through like basic training and all that stuff. And this is what we went through. We had to teach ourselves. We were early 20s when we started. Money's rolling in. We had very little business experience. So we met every week and talked till wee hours, talked through all the issues that we had, and figured out a consensus on what to do and how to handle every issue.
When you're dealing with that kind of cash, how do you handle security? How do you prevent against getting robbed? How do you do the bank drops? How do you handle all of that stuff?
Well, what we wound up doing is changing up the system. So every night we would either put the money in a safe in the basement at Leviticus, which was our flagship club, or we would assign someone to take it home. And we all had to leave together. So it wasn't just whoever carried the money and partners, it was whoever, all the bartenders, all the wait staff, we all stayed together inside the locked front door until we could all walk out together, because it was a dangerous time in New York. And fortunately, that process of going home, making sure everyone got to their car safely, no one ever got robbed. The club was robbed once. Leviticus, our flagship, was robbed once, where 6 gunmen came in with a shotgun. And we later found out it was blanks, but we didn't know it. Nobody knew that. And they fired off the shotgun and toward the ceiling. And boy, people panicked and started running. The club was full. They figured they could get the cash registers plus money from the patrons. And they were caught. And 3 of them were found dead. And I'll tell you why. There were some big time hustlers, mobsters in the room. You know, when you have a nightclub with hundreds of people, not everybody works in an office. And the discotheque era was very welcoming to everybody. It was extremely diverse. In fact, as a purely social event, I can't think of any occasion that would be more diverse. We had CEOs and mailroom clerks. We had people from Rick James to Elizabeth Taylor, from Madonna to Arthur Ashe. I mean, those are the kind of people that were in the room same time. We had big time gangsters and drug kingpins, and on occasion, FBI agents came through there. And some of these people, not all, but some of them danced together. I'm not saying the FBI agents danced, I'm sure they didn't, but a CEO might be dancing with a secretary. I mean, that was very common. You know, attractive lady, doesn't matter what her title is.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Let's take apart let's address each club. So let's talk about you were promoting at existing venues. Like, what was, I want to name a club, and I want you to describe the club for those
Sure.
who have experienced it. So tell us, like, for example, I want to start with, what is the Ginza?
Okay, Ginza was the very first club, and this is the 50th anniversary of the Ginza. It was a club on 58th Street between Park and Madison, which is a very prestigious part of midtown Manhattan, very expensive area, even back then. And it was a simple door with a black awning that said Ginza, which is a Japanese thing. And although it was owned by a Chinese guy, Mr. Chu, and you walk through the door and there's a narrow staircase going down one flight. And when you go down on one flight, you're on a balcony level and looking down one more flight onto the dance floor. So the dance floor was 2 flights down. And on the balcony level, you had a bar on one end and a DJ and on the other end, and a go-go cage for go-go girls next to the DJ booth. And downstairs where the dance floor was, you had cafe tables around the edges, and you had another bar. And Mr. Chu always had a table down there with small saucers. We had free chow mein and lo mein. It varied by day. So you could literally pay your $3 admission, and you get a free drink with that. You got a drink ticket, and we would pay the bar $1.50 for each drink ticket they turned in at the end of the night. So it was only $3 when we first started, and we made $1.50 off each person. And they got a free meal. You know, maybe it's not dinner, but it's enough to tide you over, and you got a free drink. So it was a great deal, and there was no question we were going to resonate. And it not only resonated, it created a whirlwind line down the block and around the corner. It was awesome. It was so powerful. We went to a club that was 2.5 times its size in short order around the corner and opened that up and wound up doing 2 nights at each. Actually 3 nights at the second club, the bigger club. We did 3 nights eventually. 2 nights at the Ginza. Club around the corner was La Martinique on 57th Street. And then we added Barney Google's, we added Casablanca, we added Almunia. So we had 7 events a week and making a lot of money. And one by one, as these clubs either closed down or leases expired, or they decided to stand at the door and collect the cash themselves, we started building our own clubs. And as I say, we started in '73 with our first club in Queens to learn how to manage a bar. It was a small club.
What was it called?
Lucifer's.
Lucifer's. Tell us about Lucifer's.
Lucifer's was our opportunity to learn the bar business. You know, we knew how to promote, how to get people in the door, but we never had staff to manage. The only staff we had was a bouncer. Mm-hmm. So we had to learn how to manage the bar, how to make sure we didn't get ripped off behind the bar, how to order liquor. So
explain all that to us. How do you not get ripped off? How do you order liquor? How do you manage staff?
Well, you know, bartenders, at the time, I didn't know much of this, but since those days, bartenders have a lot of tricks they can use. The main thing bartenders do is to give away free drinks because they get a bigger tip. And the free drinks can just wipe out your profits, sink deep into your profits. They also, I've seen bartenders who are unscrupulous, who could take a full bottle of liquor, put it in the garbage bag, take the garbage out, then take the liquor out, put it in their trunk. Then they wind up with a bottle. Some bartenders will bring a bottle with them and sell it behind the bar and keep all that money in their pocket. So we're aware of things like that that can be done. So they're tricks. And I'm not saying that ever happened to us. For us, what it was free drinks primarily, you know. you had some big spenders. And what we wound up doing, quite frankly, is recognizing that it's not a bad idea to give out a free drink to a good customer on occasion. So we allowed the bartenders a certain amount of latitude. We gave them a 15% leeway. But we had meters on our bottles when we first started. The meters advanced 1 click with every tilt. So you pour a drink, you got another number on the meter. So we'd read the meter at the beginning of the night, at the end of the night, and you could do the math and figure out how much money should be in the till approximately, because some drinks have 2 liquors. But you get a rough idea, a pretty good idea, not rough, a pretty good idea how much money should be in the till. And based on that, we fired a lot of bartenders. And some we rehired because that's when we changed our policy. Said, okay, we'll give you 15% so you give out some free drinks. But you got to be mindful of how much you're giving out. It was a very interesting situation.
Wow.
We learned a lot. And I'll tell you, my DJ partners, it's interesting. 8 of us were all working full time, but one by one, we quit our day jobs to work in the clubs. And 2 of the first guys who quit their day jobs, they were teachers, Tony and Danny. They wound up being extremely effective in operating our clubs. So effective and so good at managing clubs that some of our competitors up the street from Lucifer's, it was on Linden Boulevard in Queens, about a dozen bars along that strip. Some of them would come to us on a Friday night or Saturday night late saying, hey, we ran out of Hennessy, could you give us an extra bottle? We'll pay it back next week. And it's illegal to do that, but of course we did it, because we wanted to be good neighbors and we didn't want to put anyone out of business. But it just goes to show that these other folks who were in the business a long time, they were older than us, weren't as good as my partners were in managing the bar and making sure that the orders were in properly to get the steady supply that's needed.
Was bottle service a thing back then like it is now in terms of like VIP area and like?
No, the only bottle service that was really big was champagne. We didn't do bottle service for scotch or gin or vodka. It wasn't like that. But champagne, yes, and it was big. And I can tell you this, Leviticus, which was our flagship club on 33rd Street in Manhattan, between 5th and Broadway, we were the #1 Dom Perignon account in the country. #1 in the country. And that's because not so much the office workers were buying it, but we had a lot of drug kingpins. We had a lot of numbers guys, a lot of hustlers of all kinds. Not that the room was filled with them, it was only a few, but when they came, they didn't buy a bottle. They bought many bottles. Because when you think about it, if you're a drug dealer, where are you going to spend your money? What are you going to do? They fit in because it was a welcoming environment. It was Black folks. Everyone was dressed up like they were. And everyone was looking to have a good time. And because of the way Tony and Danny managed the club and related to these people, they never applied their trade inside our clubs. They viewed it as a place that they would respect because they knew they could go there and have fun. They got to have a place to go to. And they had no place else that was as good as that. That was the best choice they had. And that's why they came so regularly. And it was a small number of people, a very small percentage. And you wouldn't even know they were there if you were just on an average guy coming in. But they're very observant. They knew who else was in the room, I can tell you that.
Opening a nightclub in New York, I hear, is very difficult. How did you navigate that space? How did you secure the liquor license? The rumor is back then, all clubs were mob related, I had mob ties. How did you navigate that and safely?
Well, part of it was, back then, the mob did not go after squares, people who live by the law. We never asked for a favor, never was late with our rent, never had to request a special consideration. As soon as you do that, you're in their grasp. So we also had a powerful attorney who served many of the mob's clubs, the ones that were owned by the mob. There's a guy named Matty the Horse Iannello, Matty the Horse Iannello. He's dead now, but he he controlled the Times Square area that included where Leviticus was. He owned or controlled 300 different clubs, according to the New York Times. And he owned some of them, but most of them he controlled by collecting money each week for security. And they approached us, two guys approached us. We called our attorney, who represented a lot of the mobster guys, and he called them off. He said, don't mess with these guys. They're honest. I don't know what he said, but whatever he said, it worked. And they came back and apologized to us and said, we'll never see you again. And they did. There's a whole story behind that, which is in the book, and how it actually went down. But it was the scariest experience we had in the nightclub business, because they don't back down. They never back down. And if they say they're going to do something, they will do it, because they were known to torch clubs. They torched a place called the Tamberlane, which was owned by Mr. Chu at the Ginza. And I don't know what circumstance was. All I know is it was torched. So, you know, goons with tire irons, you never know what they're going to do.
Wow.
They like to break legs too.
Music. Talk to us about the sound system in the club. How important was that? And how important was the DJ? Did you have a name DJ? Did the DJ matter? Or just have somebody spinning records? Talk about how important was the sound and the ambiance to creating the vibe? That's
a great question, because back then DJs really weren't a thing. There were a few, but they weren't a thing yet, quite frankly. And my partners, who two of them, Danny and CP, decided they would learn how to DJ. And Danny says he learned some things from a guy named Gary Brodus, who worked at the Hippopotamus. Now, Gary Brodus taught him the basics, but just knowing how to beat match or slip cue does not make you a good DJ. What Danny did was spend a lot of time, hours in the record shop, listening to sounds of different music, picking out the songs with the right tempo, the infectious beat, that irresistible beat that you want to dance to. He found stuff that was never even on the radio. And it changed the way radio stations played music, because they wound up getting phone calls from our customers saying, how come you're not playing so-and-so? It's a hot song, you should play so-and-so. People like Manu Dibango, and even Donna Summer's Love to Love You Baby, before it hit, because they were reluctant to release it because it was so sexy. But we were playing it at our club and other clubs too. We weren't the only ones. But when the discotheque people embraced the music, the radio stations felt it was okay to put it on air. So the music was curated in such a way and played in such a way that if people were having a really good time to a particular song, they could continue it. Live bands have a hard time doing that. This was the first time you had that kind of emotional, almost religious connection to the dancers. And it created a powerful, euphoric experience, unlike anything these dancers had ever experienced before. And being young and a lot more athletic at that young age, these folks were able to dance all night long. It wasn't like you dance and sit down like, you know, a lot of older folks do. They were dancing all night. And they came there specifically to dance. And because of the way we control the door and our policies, people felt comfortable. They knew it was an environment where they could meet someone who might become a friend or a business partner or even a spouse. And a lot of people got married who met at our clubs, lots of them. I would say safely hundreds through the years, 5 clubs, 12 years for the longest running club. Had to be hundreds. A lot of them got married at our club during the Sunday afternoon kind of thing. So I can attest to that.
Let's talk about management. I want to dissect management of the club end to end. You talked about managing the door. What does that mean?
Well, it means when people are not dressed properly, you have to have the ability to turn them away properly. So that they don't get angry and frustrated with you. So that means you have to have consistency with the door. You can't make exceptions. One night, a guy named Freddie Myers New York Freddie Myers came in. We didn't know who he was. He had jeans on, and apparently Tony, one of my partners, invited him. And he said, you don't let me in, I'm coming back to get you. We later found out it was New York Freddie Myers, who was he took over for Nicky Barnes. When Nicky Barnes went to jail, New York Freddie Myers took over his drug business. So he was a powerful guy, a criminal, but a powerful guy who was not afraid to kill or hurt somebody, because that's what you do when you're in those positions. Nicky Barnes went to jail, and he did some bad things. But we had a bouncer named Bob Cherry, who was a fantastic guy. He was an iron palm. He could do things with his hand that wouldn't be amazing, but he would never hurt his hand because he had an iron palm, they call it. And he was a known guy. He used to work at the Dome. A lot of folks knew him. A lot of the gangsters knew him. And Bob Cherry diffused the situation, took Freddie Myers outside, talked to him. Freddie left, didn't come back that night, and didn't try to hurt any of us. So, God bless Bob Cherry. He passed away some years ago, but he was one of our best managers. He was the manager for Leviticus. Wow. Strong guy, soft-spoken, could de-escalate any situation. He would have been a great police officer in today's environment. That's the kind of person you need.
And then talk about managing, like the breakdown about the bar was fantastic. How do you talk about staffing? So you're doing a party, you're doing Leviticus on a Friday night, Saturday night, right? How do you know how much staff you need in terms of bar backs, bartenders, security, how do you staff the venue in terms of headcount?
Well, Tony Cooper basically handled that part of it, along with Danny Berry. And what they did, which was very clever, they hired, our bouncers were all black belts in different areas. And two of them, Lionel and Ronnie Austin, brothers, they're kind of small of stature, but they had a dojo. They were senseis. They taught karate. And they weren't the only ones that had connections with the martial arts. We had Tom LaPuppet, who was a big name in karate circles in New York. We had Frank Judge and Bob Cherry, I mentioned, with his iron palm. Those guys connected us with people who had martial arts skills. So every one of our staff members knew martial arts. Now, the interesting thing is they never had to use it. We never had an incident inside the club where they got to use or even threaten to use their skills. We had a couple incidents at the door, but nothing inside the club. And but that was one element. Another element was when we first started, Tony was very clever. He was our president. Tony Cooper went to neighboring bars in Queens. Lucifer's was in Queens. That was our first start. And he looked at who was doing a great job behind the bar. He offered them a job because you can tell who knows what they're doing and who looks proficient. And that was a smart way to do it, I thought. So he wound up staffing Lucifer's that way. And through word of mouth and so forth, he staffed our other clubs. In terms of how many people, well, it's a little hit and miss because you have to have enough people to anticipate the bigger size crowd you think will come. And gradually we found out that Saturday night, of course, is much bigger than a Monday night. So Monday night you have less staff. One Monday night we were in a meeting at our office in Midtown, a couple of miles away from Leviticus. We got a call from Bob Cherry. There was a private party that night. We figured a couple dozen people might come in the private party and maybe another 100 or so. And Bob said, hundreds of people here. You got to get over here quick. So this private party is much bigger than we thought. It almost filled the room. So Danny and Tony ran over there. Come to find out it was a lady whose birthday it was, and she must have been somebody special because she had a lot of folks there in the room who were very wealthy. A lot of millionaires were in the room, including some who were in the underworld. So we quickly recognized that when you have a private party, you better staff up appropriately because you never know.
Mm. Let's talk about life cycle. And correct me if I'm wrong, I imagine that most clubs have a life cycle, right? When it first opens, there's this hype and excitement, right? So it pops, and then either people get used to it over time, or new clubs open, and then it lulls. So how did you, one, is that a fair assessment? And then two, how did you keep your clubs relevant when clubs have a life cycle?
Yeah, it is a fair assessment. We noted that many clubs only lasted a couple of years. Studio 54 was open less than 3 years. Our club was open for 12 years. And what we did, and CP, Charles Perry, one of my partners, he was very clever. We wound up, every few years, you have to refurbish and redo the club because you have thousands of people going through there every night or every week, really. And so you've got to restore it. And what he did was he renamed it Leviticus International and started adding live acts as to supplement or complement the disco dancing. So we still have the disco dancing, but every Thursday night we had live music. People like Cuba Gooding and the Whispers before they got real big. When they had that big hit, they were too big for us. They started playing the Garden, but guess what? We knew their manager so well. Every time they played at the Garden, they had their after party at our club. So we got close to a lot of record label heads and executives because they came down to hear what people were dancing to. Because you can't see that in the radio. Did the same thing. All the radio stations sent their top DJs. Frankie Crocker, Ken Spider Webb. All these guys came down to our club regularly. And of course, Frankie, I don't know if you know that name, but he was a big DJ. Fur coat down to the ankles, fur hat, Rolls Royce sitting outside. I don't think I'm speaking out of school when I say he accepted payola, because he did. Back then, everybody took payola. It was the way the business worked. It was technically illegal, but it's kind of like jaywalking. You ever jaywalk? Well, it's illegal, but you do it. And so it was the kind of thing that was very common back in those days, especially. Since then, they've clamped down, but I can tell you their favor is still being done to get certain records played on playlists. That's where the battle is right now, like Spotify and so forth. How do you get on a playlist, with your song? And I'm sure their favor is being done somewhere.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the club interior. How important is lighting and design to the club's ambiance? And then how did you address it in your clubs?
Well, Tony Cooper's dad was a carpenter. He finished basements. He never did a nightclub. But I give credit to Tony and Danny for coming up with a formula for building our nightclubs, because we built them all from scratch, except for one. That we took over the debt for Bogard's and took over the club as it existed. But all the other clubs we built from scratch. And the formula was this: white stucco walls, white bar, black and white checkerboard dance floor. That was our signature. And a red and black patterned commercial carpeting. And we also had levels. All the rooms we started off in were all one level. We created levels, like a step up to go with cafe tables. We set it up so that, like in Leviticus, if you are on one end of the side of the bar closest to the dance floor, you're standing. On the other side of the bar, you're at the same height if you're sitting, because it was elevated. You know what I mean? So you're in the back of the bar, you can still see the dance floor, still enjoy the dancers. And, it's very clever. So Tony's father, Mr. Cooper, he built all our clubs and he designed it that way. Now the lighting got more and more gradually more interesting, because when we first started, there was no disco ball. No one had a disco ball. So we had lighting, and we had nightclub lighting, like we dim it a little bit. Then we started adding movement. And when the balls first came out, we added disco balls, but we had a lot of other things. It wasn't just disco balls. The disco era had a lot of different kinds of lighting, things that moved, that changed, whirled, twirled around, strobe lights, that blinked. We had all kinds of fancy things. We didn't have all of it, but we had parts of it in different clubs.
Wow. Wow.
So it was a learning process. Keep in mind, when we first started, there was no such thing as disco music. So, you know, there was no such thing as manipulating a record the way DJs do today. You know, so we went through a very steep learning curve. And I give a lot of credit to Danny and Tony, Danny and CP, our first DJs, who figured out how to take songs and make them even better by extending because for dancing is different than listening. When you're dancing, that bridge is infectious. That bridge can really touch you. And it can almost be a religious experience.
Absolutely.
They tapped into it with great success. And so what they did was not necessarily the first time that anyone ever did it, first time in our crowd. and they had never heard anyone else do it, but I've read that some of the gays in other clubs were doing something similar a year before us. But they had a smaller environment and they just catered to gays, which is a small percentage of the population. We had a very open and diverse crowd because of the location. You know, it was around where white folks worked and lived, and they came. So we had a diverse crowd. It was black and white, rich and poor. Nick Nolte and Rick James were hanging out together one night. You ever think of those two together? Probably not, right? Nick Nolte and Rick James. Come on, what they have in common? I'll tell you what they have in common. They just wanted to get drunk and find women. And that's the truth.
Did you guys have like a club photographers? Do you have like archives of the nights at the clubs?
You know, we did toward the very end, we hired a photographer. Right around the time I left the group, because I left after 6 years or whatever it was, 8 years.
Why'd you leave?
Career, kids. You know, I had 2 girls. My wife kept saying to me, "You're missing out on an opportunity to watch the girls grow up." You know, I'd come home. Basically, the schedule was I worked every other night. And so on the nights I didn't work, I would just be exhausted, go home and crash. I get home around 7, the girls went to bed at 8. I'd see them for a quick minute and crash. And so it was a terrible ordeal because the next night I had to work. And because we had to walk out together at the end of the night after cashing out everybody, I get home about 5:30. You have to get up and go to work on some days, you know, so it was pretty tough.
So you own Leviticus, Justine's, Bogards.
Yes.
Any other club that you owned?
Yes, we own Lucifer's in Queens. Those first 3 you mentioned were in Manhattan. And they were among the first 3 Black-owned clubs in Midtown Manhattan, by the way. I heard Lloyd Price owned a club not too far from us. I never heard anything about it back then, never went to it. So I'm not sure who it attracted, but it wasn't as popular as our club, that's for sure. But we own Lucifer's in Queens and Brandi's in Brooklyn. And Brandi's in Brooklyn was a bit of a white elephant because unlike the clubs in Manhattan, which had no competition anywhere near us, we were the only ones in Midtown. As I mentioned, it was after dark, everybody left Midtown. But in Brooklyn, different story. No police presence in Brooklyn to speak of, in the Black neighborhoods anyway. And so there were a lot of after hours clubs. And at our clubs, we operated by the rules. 4 o'clock, we closed. So when we announced the last call at 3:30, some people would get upset because they expected us to open until 6 or 8 in the morning or later. And so it was a bit of a white elephant. So what we did was we operated on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, and we rented out Brandi's on Sunday night to a Haitian group, and they brought in a bigger crowd on Sunday night than we got on Saturday night. And they helped us because they took the door and we took the bar, which is the legal way to do it. And eventually we sold Brandi's and to a Jamaican friend who used to frequent Leviticus. And he set it up and got a big Jamaican, the #1 Jamaican club in the country. As a matter of fact, he had elements we did too, and they drank Moet. The Jamaican posses drank Moet. And I'm told that that was the #1 account in the country for Moet. When they ordered Moet, it wasn't like a bottle. They ordered like 6 or 8 bottles at a time. They put it in a big vase or bowl, and the bottles were laid out like the petals of a flower, and 8 at a time or 6 at a time, like that. And when it ran out, another 6, another 8. That's how they did it. That was the Jamaican posses. And interestingly, the heads of those groups could stand around the bar and drink, but their underlings could not. They had to sit at the tables. So they went to the bar and got a 6-pack of Moet splits and carried it back to their table. That was the rule, and no problems inside the club. Now, once you left the club, these posses who were at each other's throats would start acting up out there. There were some murders. They had some murders around the corner. So, but you know, it's if what I've learned is that if you treat these folks a certain way with respect, they will respect you back. At least back in those days, that's the way it worked. I'm not sure that works today. Everything's different today. But back then, the mafia didn't mess with you too much if you were square. And the bad guys who came into our clubs, the hustlers and whatever they were doing, they didn't ply their trade at our clubs because they wanted to be able to enjoy it as a place to relax. They had worked already, now they're relaxing. So it was a different vibe for them. Very interesting dynamic.
Let's talk about lessons learned.
Yeah. All of us were informed by the experience we had. So when our clubs ran their course, the longest lasting club was Leviticus, 12 years. Justine's lasted 11 years, I think it was. Tony and Danny partnered with the Dahl twins and Justice Vasquez, who was our manager at Justine's, to form a new club called the Proper Cafe in Queens. And they operated that very successfully for 30 years. It was a destination type club, twice the size of Lucifer's, and right across the street from where Lucifer's used to be. So they wound up staying in the business. CP wound up going to the Apollo, where he took over the liquor concession at the Apollo Theater. Harry, who supervised our construction, I told you had to really keep things refurbished. He wound up working for the Board of Ed and was instrumental in helping them to assess their brick and mortar needs and supervising construction projects for the Board of Ed in New York. Andre and I went back to advertising. Andre Smith, he was one of my close friends. Andre wound up forming his own management consulting firm called Fraser Smith, which lasted for his entire working career until he retired. And I wound up working for Miller Brewing Company after the advertising agency experience. I worked at Young and Rubicam and Ogilvy and Mather, and then joined Miller Brewing, worked there for about 8 years. And then I joined Moet Hennessy USA, formerly Shefflin and Somerset. And I retired from that company and worked for another 7 years as a consultant to them, to Moet Hennessy USA. And now that I'm fully retired, I had the time to write a book.
I love it. You mentioned the clubs ran their course. How do you know when the club has run its course?
When the rent goes from $6,000 to $30,000 a month. You know, New York City, when I tell you New York City was in dire straits, and this is, you know, people were fleeing. No one knew if it would ever come back. A lot of folks really believed New York City would simply become a second-rate city in the United States, and that the center of the country would be elsewhere. Well, that did not happen, of course. New York City did come back. And when it came back, landlords gouged everyone. I mean, it was, and they're still doing it. That's why you see such a turnover with certain kinds of businesses, just you can't handle it anymore. So with astronomical increases in rent, a lot of clubs went under. And I remember reading something somewhere, what we did could not be done today because of the high cost of rent.
That was actually my next question. I was like, would what you built work today?
No, it would not. You can't, too many regulations. Speaking about regulations, you asked me before about the licensing. We had no problem getting a liquor license. That was fairly straightforward. But in New York City back then, you had to get a cabaret license to allow dancing. A cabaret license was given by New York City, not the state. Liquor license given by the state. Cabaret license by the city. And they had an old requirement on that law was from the days of Prohibition, where according to Vibe magazine, you remember Vibe? Vibe magazine had a big article that said that the cabaret license was developed to help control and curtail Black clubs right after Prohibition, during and after Prohibition. They could crack down with dancing, because we like to dance more than whites, I guess. I don't know. But they cracked down on Black clubs. And it was a very difficult license to get. And I can give you some numbers. With 25,000 nightlife-oriented establishments, that includes restaurants, 25,000 in New York City, only 97 had a cabaret license. 97. That shows you how hard it was to get. So when we applied, you know what they did? They stalled. It took us 6 months to get it. And you can't even apply till your club is ready, because the inspection is part of it. So we had to build it and wait 6 months after it's built, paying that $3,500 a month rent, whatever it was back then. And fortunately we had a lot of money, but you never recover that. It's like airlines with empty seats. You never recover it. Can't go back in time. But fortunately, we got the cabaret licenses for each one of our clubs. We operated legally. That's why I say we were not underground. And that's why I wrote the book, to make sure people know we were properly licensed. And when Studio 54 was raided, it was because someone said they were hiding cash and dispensing drugs, and Ian Schrager and Steve Rebell wound up going to jail, actually, 3-year sentence. Around that time, they closed down about 4 or 5 clubs for the same reason. They also came to our club, and FBI guys, IRS guys rather, stood at the door with a clicker on a Saturday night, and then multiply that number by 7, thinking that's what our weekly take would be. So Tony and Danny had to tell them, no, on a Monday night, you're not going to get that size crowd. That's Saturday night. So we never had any problems with the IRS, fire department, police department, because we always had a clicker ourselves to make sure that not too many people were in the room. We felt we couldn't afford to run the risk of doing anything like that. There was no need to. We had too much money at stake. And by the way, each club was a separate corporation. So if one had a problem, it didn't affect the other clubs.
Very smart.
Yeah.
Very smart. Talk to us about the Disco Sucks movement. What were the roots of that, and how did it affect your business?
It definitely affected our business. That's kind of why we wound up using some live music to augment the disco. But there's a guy named Steve Dahl, who was a popular DJ in the Midwest. He was in Detroit, and he went to Chicago. And he was very good friends with the son of the White Sox owner of the White Sox. And they decided, White Sox had very small crowds back then, like 25,000 people on average in a big stadium. So they decided to take advantage of the growing dislike for disco. It didn't come from Steve Dahl, it came from rockers, white male rockers primarily, who did not want to get dressed up to go out, did not want to learn how to dance in order to get the girl, and did not want to pay an admission fee to get in. Our crowd liked all three. The admission price kept the riffraff out. It made the crowd, more comfortable. They liked to dress up. We liked to dance. But white rockers back then hated all those things. And you know what was put the icing on the cake for them? Over 100 radio stations across the country changed their format from rock to disco. Now, disco was dominated by Black and Latino performers. And they also hated that. So that's what created the disco sucks sentiment. And Steve Dahl created a night in the halftime between the Twilight doubleheader in Chicago with the White Sox, and where they invited everyone to come with a disco record, and they were going to blow up a big box of disco records on the infield at halftime, and not halftime, between games. And they successfully blew it up, and smoke all over the place, and the crowd went crazy. Hundreds of people ran onto the field, and it got so chewed up, the White Sox had to forfeit the second game because couldn't play on the field. But there was a black guy, one of the few black people in the stadium that night, who was like an usher, and he was an aspiring DJ. He was trying to collect some of these records, and he noted that a lot of them weren't disco records. They were simply records by black folks. They weren't disco records. So this is all in Vibe magazine. So that tells you right there, this is a little bit more than the music. There's a racial aspect here. And so that was interesting. And one white guy, that black usher, he was quoted as saying this: a white guy came over to me with a record in his hand, and he broke in front of me and saying, "This is little disco," boom, and broke in front of him like he was responsible for disco because he was the only black guy in the area.
Wow.
So it just goes to show there definitely was a racial component to the disco sucks movement. Now, white women liked to dance and didn't mind getting dressed up and didn't mind learning to dance, but the white guys, not so much. And that was the rub. So it was more white males, young white males, who really were pissed off that their rock was being taken off the radio.
And how did that translate to the business?
And one other thing I'll mention, because there were some white folks who played great disco music. Great, and we played a lot of it, by the way. Wild Cherry, Average White Band, and of course the Bee Gees. We played Bee Gees music. And the Bee Gees, because of that hatred toward disco, now they're from England, originally Australia, but they were living in England. When they came to this country for concerts, the FBI had to escort them from the airport because they got so many death threats. They got a lot of death threats. And I assure you, they were not the only ones who got death threats, but they were so big and so high profile, the FBI didn't want anything to happen to them because that would have really been a disaster. Wow. But they got a lot of death threats because they played disco music.
So how did the disco sucks movement affect your business, if at all?
It did, because the word disco became overused commercially and became a negative. You had Mickey Mouse disco. I mean, it was just crazy. So we never liked the word disco, and we never used the word disco. We did use discotheque early in the experience. So we didn't use it often, but we used the word discotheque because that had a little bit more sophistication to it. It felt European, and it felt more sophisticated. But the word disco became so negative, we changed Leviticus's theme line to an entertainment complex. Leviticus International, an entertainment complex. And that's when we had live music every Thursday and on certain other nights as well. I'll tell you one interesting story. One night, Prince came by with his young sister, Tyka. He heard about our Thursday night. When you have live music, I mean, anyone who wants to perform, they know about it, they want to perform. Yeah, he wasn't known at the time. He had one record out, which was over 200 on the Billboard charts. It was way down the list. I forgot the exact number, but it was way down the list. So nobody really knew Prince. And CP was the one that booked the acts. And he said, "I'm sorry, we can't book you because, we need a draw." And we were booking Whispers, Manhattans, Cuba Gooding, the main ingredient, acts like that. Phyllis Hyman, we had a lot of great acts that were known, and Prince was not known. So looking back, was it a mistake? No, CP made the right decision at that time. Prince would not have been a draw. 1 year later, he came out with an album named Prince, sold over 1 million copies. He was too big for Leviticus. Well, right off the bat, too big for us, but we played a lot of his music. So you win some, you lose some. But CP made the right decision. I mean, he had nothing else to go on. There's no way to know what he would become.
Early on, we talked about the distinction between your club and Studio 54. How would you distinguish and differentiate between your club and someplace like the Paradise Garage?
I can't answer that question because I never went to the Paradise Garage. You know, my schedule, my personal schedule was so crazy. I never quit my day job. And it was very, very difficult. Half my partners, actually most of them, quit their day jobs to work full time at the clubs. I never
you were working your day job and doing the nightclub at the same time.
Yes, and it was not an easy job. I was on Madison Avenue at Young and Rubicam, Benton and Bowles, and Ogilvy and Mayfair. And it was very, very difficult. So, and I had a growing family. That's why I decided to step down in 1978. I decided to leave the group.
Wow.
It was a big step, but I felt it was right for me. You know, the nightlife was not good if you have a family and you want to really be a family man. And so what I did worked for me.
I was going to ask, that's another question. How did you resist temptation working in the nightclubs? I'm sure people want to talk to you to get in for free, or women are flirting themselves at you. How did you navigate that space?
It's a difficult situation. It really is difficult because people didn't really try to get in free because we didn't tolerate that. That's a slippery surface. So we charged everybody, pretty much. I mean, when family came down, you know, yeah, I'll pay for you, that kind of thing. Yeah, a lot of women were throwing themselves at us. Mm-hmm. That's all I can say.
Understood. Let's talk about my last question is advice. What advice would you give to the next generation of club promoters who want to do something like what you accomplished in today's world? Now, I know the world has changed, but some people are like, yeah, I know it's harder, the rent is crazy, but I want to do my own pop-up parties or whatever. How would you coach them or advise them?
I think, you know, it comes down to diligence and persistence. You really should never give up. Don't give up. You have to work hard to come up with a plan that can work. You know, the diligence is doing your homework to make sure that the business model is sound. Can you make money if you do it a certain way, and you know, with these expenses and this, you know, if you do all that properly, I think you wind up on a good page. You know, one of the things we did early on, recognizing the windfall we were achieving, it was tremendous windfall and we didn't expect it. We didn't plan on it, but it just started coming in so fast and furious. We actually invited promoters from Boston, Chicago, Detroit, Boston, Chicago, DC, and Philly. We had them come to New York. Now, only DC and Philly came. Boston and Chicago didn't come. But DC and Philly promoters came. We rented a suite near Kennedy Airport where they flew in, and we took them with a flip chart presentation, showed them how we did what we did, because we felt they could do the same thing we're doing and they can have a windfall. Because it was like a moment in time. We knew it wouldn't last forever. Let them make some good money also. And it's actually, some people felt it would last forever. And some of my partners carved out their whole career from it. The guys in Philly and DC both continued to pursue it. It was a big success for both of them. In Philly, they call themselves the Best of Friends, kind of after us. And they had modeled their experience a lot after us. They had 4 clubs, I think it was, 4 or 5 clubs in Philly, kind of like what we did. And in DC, they call themselves the Fox Trap. I don't know if you ever heard of that. The Fox Trap was very popular for many years. The Fox Trap was a building like a brownstone with different levels and a different vibe on each level, like jazz, a lounge, dancing, you know, that kind of thing. On each level, a different activity. And we all stayed close, where we reciprocated. If you're in DC or Philly, you get to go to their clubs for free. They get to come to our clubs for free. I have a picture of some of the guys from Philly, the Philadelphia Best of Friends, in my book. And it was, we even wound up through Mal Wolfick, one of my partners. He wound up working at the WBLS. Later found out he was a part owner all along of WBLS. God bless him. But Mal got very close to, he got close with these promoters. He organized the World Conference of Black promoters, Black club owners, sorry. World Conference of Black Club Owners. Association of Black Club Owners, ABC, Association of Black Club Owners. And we had 2 conventions, one in New York at Leviticus, and I have a picture of that in the book. And the second one was in Atlantic City, and no, I'm sorry, Bermuda. It was in Bermuda, and that was the last one because they didn't continue it. But Danny and Tony went, and they were had such a good time with all these folks that they went back every year for 10 years straight.
Wow.
And Danny said it was one of the best trips he's ever had. So they reproduced it every year for 10 years.
So the question is, how do I get a copy of this PowerPoint presentation flip chart that you showed in JFK Airport? I'm ready to start. I'm ready to go. Let's do this.
Well, I got to tell you, I don't think that exists anymore, but the key elements are in the book. I spell out the process we had for screening people at the door, the penalties for misbehaving in the club, because it wasn't just doing drugs in the bathroom. If you raise your voice, we never had a fight. When I look back, that's absolutely incredible. Never had a fight in the clubs. Thousands, tens of thousands of people through the years, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands went through those clubs through the years. Never had a fight. We had incidents, but never a fight. And that's remarkable when you consider the diversity of people we had in the room. You know, Tony used to say, he never worried too much about the hustlers and gangsters. He said, we were all right with them. He was more worried about a straight person, getting to an argument with one of those guys, because if that happened, it could only end in one way.
Yeah.
It would only end one way. And so that was his concern. And, you know, Tony was the closest to that because he was the first one to quit his day job and knew more about the nightclub business than anyone else. He was the one that was basically our leader. And I give him credit for managing the relationships, the diversity of relationships. We had off-duty policemen in the room, a lot of them. Some of them were good friends. And, you know, so you never knew who somebody was. We had blue-collar guys and service guys who went home and put on their best suits. You couldn't tell them apart from a CEO. You didn't know who they were. But everyone got along well. And as I say, the environment was very welcoming. So, you know, it was it almost was a case study in how to get along with different people. Maybe we need more of that today.
Knowing what you know now, how would you approach this differently if you were to start again today?
I would have invested more in real estate.
Explain.
Well, the building Leviticus was in is a 5-story building. We had a chance to buy it, and we did plan to buy it. It made sense because the mortgage would have been roughly the same as the rent. Now, keep in mind, New York City was going straight down at that time. So it was not like a slam dunk easy decision. You know, if it continued to go down, you could be left holding the bag, you know, so it was not a slam dunk, but we decided to proceed. But it was a Thursday night when we reached a verbal agreement. But before the contracts could be signed, the company that owned the building was sold. And the new owner did not honor anything that was not in writing. And so we lost out. Now, the other thing we could have done, it didn't seem glamorous to us at the time, but looking back, we probably should have done it. We could have bought a McDonald's franchise and then bought a whole bunch of them. That idea of having, you know, like 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 franchises never really occurred to us. We were thinking of a franchise. And flipping burgers and stuff like that was not as glamorous and sexy as the nightclub business to some of my partners. So, but looking back, we probably should have pursued that. We would have wound up owning multiple stores and maybe different franchises on top of McDonald's. Who knows? But that would have given us stability and a more continuous big income. So that's what I would say looking back.
I want to go back to the money one more time. You talked about at a macro level, you do millions of dollars a year. What would an average club take in on a night, both at the door and at the bar?
Well, I would say, first of all, you're talking about a 14-year span when we first started, when we ended. So the money changed a lot over time, because when we first started, it was $3 admission and you got a free drink. And toward the end, it was $10 admission, no drink. So big, big difference. But you can do the math. We figure $10 admission and figure 1,000 people, because you have a flow. The room can hold 600 or 800, whatever, but you have a flow during the course of a night. So you're going to get at least 1,000 people. On a holiday night, you could get 1,200, 1,400. So that's the door. And there's no expense associated with it. With the bar, you figure 50 cents a drink. And you figure everybody figure at least one drink ahead, that kind of thing. So you can do the math on that.
It's really good. That's really, really good.
It begins to add up, because you're doing it. You're not going to get that big a crowd every night, but you will, like, maybe 3 nights a week. And then the other nights, maybe you get, half or a third of the size crowd. But you always have the holidays. And with the holidays, you have an explosion of people coming in, and an extra night, typically. If Monday's a holiday, man, Sunday night's huge. I'll tell you one thing that was really surprising. We opened up early November, Leviticus, our flagship, early November. And Thanksgiving night, we figured it would be a slow night. Wow, were we wrong? Massive, massive. After everyone ate, you're hanging around all day with the family, people wanted to go out. And, we're talking about a young crowd, 20s. We were in our 20s. And it was a massive crowd. Christmas Eve and Christmas night, same thing, huge crowds. So that was a bit surprising to me. I still remember that, being so surprised, like, wow. And interestingly, like Christmas, I met a lot of people who didn't spend Christmas with family or Thanksgiving with family. Sometimes they had family, sometimes not. Sometimes the family's in another city, but some people had family but chose to spend it with us instead. We were their family.
Wow. Wow. One more. Everyone thinks nightclub stuff is glory, happiness, whatever. What's the worst part of the job?
The hours. It's painful. For me, it became drudgery, almost drudgery. You wind up, I'm different than the other guys. Some of the other guys, we had 2 factions in the group. Those who believed 100% in the nightclub business as their career path. And for me, I thought the discos were like a good stepping stone. And I wanted to step into something more reliable and long lasting. And we made some efforts. We created other businesses, travel agency, a search firm and stuff like that. But it never really turned the corner. It never was brought in significant money. So I focused more on my day job, my career in marketing. And that turned out to be a better move for me personally. But the hours were punishing, long hours. And like I said, you get there, if you open at 9 or 10 and you close at 4 in the morning, you can't leave till 5 o'clock, maybe 4:45. You get home, it's 5:30. So it's a lot of time. And if you're willing to spend that kind of time, it's okay. But if you have a day job, it's not okay. It becomes very difficult.
Those are the questions that I had. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you wanted to speak on?
I would just say that this experience that I had in the book that I wrote really showcases an authentic look at Black middle class. And we were exposed to them. And interestingly, a lot of folks that we had as customers were not necessarily white collar workers, but they behaved like white collar workers inside the club. My job primarily was collecting cash at the door. That's not an easy thing to assign to an employee. So I had on more than one occasion, a customer would come up and say, I have just enough money to get in and buy one drink. So not everybody had a lot of money. I even cashed a welfare check once. But the crowd we catered to was very much a middle-class African-American crowd. And many of them went on to do very well in life and very successful. So it's a great book from the standpoint of showcasing a portion of the Black community that doesn't get too much publicity.
Actually, that brings up another point. While the Paradise Garage was a safe haven for gay and transgender people, mm-hmm. It's almost as though your clubs were a safe haven for Black people, and that I heard that some of the white clubs wouldn't allow Blacks in, or make up some kind of rules or regulations. So in a way, your clubs were a safe space for Black people to party and celebrate. That's
exactly what they were, but they weren't just for Blacks.
Exactly.
And I got to tell you, when we first started as promoters, the clubs were even more diverse then, because we keep in mind, like at the Ginza, for example, we were only there Thursday nights initially. And mostly Asian and white customers came on other nights. So some of them came on our nights also. So we had a very diverse crowd. Same thing at La Martinique, which was our second club. Over time, it became perhaps a little bit more all Black, but Leviticus was always diverse. And the white folks came to Leviticus, a lot of them were Europeans. We had a lot of Africans from the UN. We had a lot of Caribbeans. We had a lot of African Americans, and we had white New Yorkers who just came. A lot of them some of them were in the record industry, some of them were not, and we had all kinds of people. So and we always had a lot of Latinos, by the way. Always had a lot of Latinos, and some of them were our competitors. A guy named Jimmy Gonzalez was operating. What's his name? Jimmy, I forgot his last name. But anyway, he had discotheques. He didn't always have all the licensing we did, but he had discotheques around the same time. Mm-hmm. So it was a very interesting environment for those days to showcase a very conservative. It's amazingly conservative given the reputation of places like Studio 54 and Visage and some of the other high-end clubs they flaunted fancy outfits, scanty outfits, drugs, sex. We didn't have any of that in our clubs. I'm not saying everybody was drug-free, but they didn't do it in the club. If they were caught, they were banned for like at least 30 days, depending on the infraction.
When you and your wife go out to clubs today, do you find yourself saying, "Oh, I wouldn't manage it like this, or I'll do stuff differently, or if I was doing this, I would move the entrance over here, and I would move the bar over here," or are you able to just like go in and enjoy it?
Not so much of that, but I must say, when we travel, and we do a fair amount of traveling, whether it's China, Paris, Africa, you know what we do? We go to nightclubs. And I got to tell you, when you go to a nightclub in a different country, you see a part of that country you can't see it any other way. You can't. You see the real people, and I encourage everyone to do that. Now, you've been to Ibiza, so you know what I'm talking about. But going to the nightclubs and nightlife, whether it's even if it's a jazz club, you see the city that you're in a different light than you're able to see any other way. And it's a different look, and it gives you an authentic feeling, and I think it gives you a better understanding of that city as well.
Well said. We'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Awesome.
I enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
All right, you too. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.